Hello everybody, you joined me in the workshop where I wanted to talk about these, which are some sculpture bases. I made these a while back, and although they're sort of fairly basic forms, they actually presented some rather interesting challenges with regards to moulding and just putting these together in general. So I thought it might be interesting to go through sort of trials and tribulations I had with making these, because although they possibly seem relatively simple in terms of what they are, it actually took a bit of a journey to actually get to this point. So yeah, these are sculpture bases, and I'll cut in some B-roll here of some sculptures with the bases so you can sort of get an idea. And this is something that I've wanted for a very long time. I had a sculpture of an orc from Weta Workshop from Lord of the Rings many years ago, and you can see it here, and it's got this a similar shaped base to it, and I always thought that added a certain something to the sculpture. It sort of looks quite nice. It sort of, I don't know, just makes it look a bit more professional, you know, and sort of finishes off the sculpture in quite a nice way. I'm sure you've encountered when you've been making something in the same way that I have, that you've got your sculpture but the base itself is a bit kind of rubbish or basic, or maybe it's just a piece of wire sticking out a block of wood. You know how these things go, and so you want to kind of finish it off, and you want it to look as nice as it possibly can. Now, I've often thought that you need to put as much detail into the base as you do to the sculpture to sort of, I don't know, make it part of the overall experience of looking at the piece. And I've often done that. You know, I've added some detail to the base, maybe made it a diorama, something like that, or, you know, just added some sort of detail that's in keeping with the sculpture itself to fully sort of complete the piece. I've also used things like plumbing pipe, which I've soldered together to create bases, and just so there's something there for the viewer to see, you know, to sort of fully finish off the experience of looking at the sculpture. But my mind always kept coming back to this orc. You know, the orc looked, I don't know, just professional. I mean, it's Weta Workshop, so obviously it's going to be quite professional, but there's something about that base that really sort of said to me that's a pro sculpture, and that's a nice piece of work. So I always wanted to have a base like that, but I couldn't find any anywhere. You know, there was nothing that I could find online that I could buy that was like a ready-made base that I could then add to my sculptures. So for many years I was a bit stuck, so I sort of made do with what I could, you know, and I would sculpt up details to add to the base and that sort of thing. But a few years back I got a lathe, which you can see just down there, and so I actually had the opportunity to start putting this together myself, so that's what I did. So I got some acetal rod, which have I got on board? Which is this stuff. So it's just a sort of hard tooling plastic, so you put that in the lathe and you can lathe that down to any shape you need. Now, this sort of shape that I came up with has obviously got this sort of fluted look to it, so this wasn't something I could directly do with the tools on the lathe, because they sort of go forward, backward, or a diagonal. Doing curves is a little bit tricky, and so what I had to do is actually get some hand tools, which are these sorts of things. These are cheap as chips. I got like 15 of these for about 20 quid on eBay, and they're a bit rubbish. You can spend hundreds if you want to, but all I really wanted was that, which was a curved point, and that would allow me to sort of do that sort of fluted look that I wanted. Now, it took a little bit of back and forth. I had a few goes. I initially poured some resin out and started using that as my tooling material. What I found though was that there were air bubbles within the resin, which didn't really work. And the reason I tried that first is because the resin is so much more softer. You can tool it much more easily than you can the acetal. But because of the finish, it wasn't really going to work. These are meant to be sort of quite high polish, and they actually polish up quite nicely on the polishing wheel. So I couldn't really use resin in the end. So in the end, I thought, right, I'll just go with the acetal and do it that way. This stuff's much tougher than resin, so it's a little bit more of a task, and it's also, you can quite easily screw it up. You know, if you go too quickly, you can cause it to jam and you can screw it up. So it's a little bit more work is what I'm saying, but I eventually got there, and these are what I came up with. So these are my masters, and as you can see, they're quite polished, so there was a lot of polishing going on, a lot of sanding to get the finish that I wanted. Now, that was fine, I had my master, so then what I wanted to do was make a mould, and that's when things started getting tricky. So the problem with these is that, particularly the large one, they're quite tall and thin, And what I was finding with the original moulds that I made was that you couldn't get the pieces back out of the mould. And because of the shape, there wasn't really a way for the air to get into the mould in order for the piece to come out. So what you had was this sort of suction effect whereby you couldn't pull the cast back out of the mould. It was really, really tough to do. So I had to contend with the problem, like, how do I allow air to get into the mould to allow the piece to come out? So here are a variety of the moulds that I originally made. I don't actually have the original one that I did, but basically what it was a mould like this. And basically I enclosed the piece in a pint glass, plastic pint glass, poured some silicone in, and I came up with a mould very similar to this. Now the problem with it, like I said, was I just couldn't get it back out again. I couldn't get a grip on it to pull it out, and what I eventually had to do was to drill a screw into the base of the cast, put it in a vise, and then pull that off. Now I did eventually manage to get it out, but it took a lot of work, and I thought, well, that can't be a realistic way of doing it. You know, if I'm going to do like loads of these, because obviously I'm going to produce lots of sculptures for myself and to sell, that can't be the manufacturing process for this. So I started looking into ways to get around that, and the first thing I hit on was the fact that because the air can't get in, I need a way of releasing the air from the mould once the cast is set. So what I came up with was this idea, which is to have a plunger in the end of the mould. So basically what I did was to take my master and I put this in the top of it. So that was the piece that I made the mould of. And the idea being that once you take your master out and you're left with the shape of the piece that you want to cast, this will be sitting in the end of the mould. So what you do is you pour your resin into here, let it set, and then you can pull this out, and that will leave a hole in the end of the mould. So when you then come to move your piece out of the mould, there's a place for the air to get in. And that made things a lot easier to actually deal with. So although I do have to still put a screw into the base of this cast in order to get it out, having that there allows the air to get into the mould and thus release the cast much more easily. Now I went through a few iterations of this. The first one I made had really thick walls, and as you can see here, I've actually tried to carve out some gaps into the silicone in order to make that a little bit more flexible. I've actually started cutting this one up and using it as ballast for other moulds. I didn't really use this one in the end, it didn't really work out quite so well. So I moved on to this one, and this one worked well enough, but even though I've got this cavity to allow the air to get in, there's still quite a lot of mechanical force placed on the mould, because I have to literally put it off in quite an extreme fashion. But what I found was that I was starting to get imperfections creeping into the mould, and this is something that happens with moulds over time, generally speaking anyway, but because there was quite a lot of mechanical pressure being placed on this, I found that the mould was deteriorating quite quickly. Now if you look at the cast here, it's quite a polished thing, you know, there's quite a smooth finish to it. And so you don't really want any imperfections to show up on this. You want it to be quite a highly reflective piece. So any imperfections in the mould were really a no-no here. So I made another mould, which is this one. It's made from a slightly different silicone, which is a little bit more hard wearing. And so far this is doing pretty well. But I started thinking, well, maybe what I can do is actually change the type of silicone that I'm using to make the mould. So for the smaller bases, I had the same type of mould as the larger one. You can see the two there. And again, I started finding that I was getting imperfections. So I don't know if you can see here. Yeah, there you go. See, a chunk of silicone has come out of the side there. So again, I think that was just due to the mechanical stress of getting the piece out of the mould in the first place. So what I decided to do was actually use a softer silicone. So what I came up with was this, and these are the moulds I'm currently using. And I don't know how apparent it is on the video, but this is much softer than this. So this is a platinum cure silicon, an addition cure silicon. So there's two types of silicon. There's tin silicon and platinum silicon. Tin tends to be a bit cheaper than platinum, as you may imagine, and it's usually the type of silicon that you would find for mould making. Platinum silicons can be used for mould making, but they're also used in prosthetic makeups and skin for like animatronic creatures, things like that, because they're much more stretchy. They have a lower shore hardness, and so they're much softer than the tin silicons. They're also meant to be a little bit more long wearing as well, but a little bit more hardy. So I thought this might be quite a good material to try my mould with. And so far that seems to be the case. It's much easier to get the piece out of this because it's much softer. I'm still using the same plunger idea so that the air can get into the mould. But yeah, they're much easier to demould the final cast, so that's quite good. I did have a few problems with this one. As you see, so there's some gaps in the edge there. Not too much of a problem, although there is a bit of a blob of resin on the cast. I can just cut that off with a knife pretty easily. So I've got 2 of these, and so far they're lasting pretty well. So fingers crossed that's going to be the way forward with this. I'm still using this mould for the larger piece, but I think once that starts wearing out, I will make another one in the softer silicone. I have some worries about whether that's going to sort of have its own structural strength, you know, whether it's going to retain its shape well enough. That's relatively sturdy, you know, it can hold its shape. That's a little bit softer, so possibly there might be some deformation if I make a larger mould. Not quite sure. If it comes to it, I can make a hard case around it to hold it in place. But yeah, so that's sort of my journey in a sense of into making bases for sculptures. Something that sort of seems relatively simple actually turned out to be quite complicated. But I think all that effort was really worth it. I think with a lot of these things, the sort of philosophy I've sort of got to is the fact that if I'm making something, the thing I'm making isn't necessarily the final version. A lot of the time you need to iterate on an idea, and so one idea is to not try and make one of the thing you're making, but maybe make 5, you know, and hopefully like 2 or 3 of them will be good. Maybe the other 2 won't be quite so good. So that's sort of the approach I took here. You know, I wanted the final piece to look decent, but I knew that I was going to have to iterate on it and try and sort of tease out all the problems that I'd encountered along the way until I could get to a final solution. So I think it was worth it. I mean, I've always wanted bases like these, and I think they do add a certain something to a sculpture. So yeah, there was a bit of a journey with that one, so I thought it might be interesting just to talk through all of the challenges that this sort of thing presented itself. Like I said, these are relatively simple shapes, so you wouldn't have thought it would take so much effort to get to a final product with this, but in actual fact it took, well, months I guess of iteration and experimentation to actually get to a point that I was happy with and that I could produce these things quite easily. So just goes to show it's not the complicated things that really get in the way. Sometimes it can be the simple things. So yeah, I think that's it. Just a sort of a quick look at kind of a minor thing really, but something that I think really does add a certain something to a sculpture. I think having a decent base does sort of give a finished look to a sculpture, you know, so it's worth sort of persevering with the smaller details of a sculpture, I think, sometimes, because it does add to the overall experience. So I hope that was interesting, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.